In the shadowed corridors of human interaction, where words dance like double-edged swords and intentions mask themselves behind veils of civility, there exists a weapon so profound, so devastatingly effective, that most never recognize its presence until they have already fallen victim to its power. This weapon requires no forging, no sharpening, no external force whatsoever. It is silence, not the passive absence of sound, but the deliberate, calculated withholding of response, the strategic void that draws others into its depths like quicksand draws the unwary traveler. Marcus had learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. Standing in the mahogany-paneled boardroom of Crimson Industries, watching his former mentor deliver what should have been a career-ending blow, he remained perfectly still. The accusations flew like arrows: embezzlement, corporate espionage, betrayal of trust. Each word was carefully chosen, each pause calculated to maximize damage. Around the table, 12 pairs of eyes watched him, waiting for the explosion, the desperate defense, the pleading that would seal his fate. But Marcus had already destroyed that version of himself, the version that would have stammered excuses, the version that would have appealed to their better nature, the version that believed in fairness and justice in corporate warfare. That Marcus had died months ago in a hotel room in Singapore, when he discovered his mentor's own embezzlement scheme and realized that his naive trust had made him the perfect scapegoat. So he said nothing. He simply sat there, his hands folded calmly on the polished table, his breathing steady and controlled. The silence stretched like a taut wire, growing more uncomfortable with each passing second. His accusers began to shift in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. The CEO glanced at his watch. In the absence of the expected response, the entire dynamic of the room began to change. This is the first principle of Machiavellian silence: it forces others to fill the void, and, in doing so, they reveal far more than they ever intended. When we speak in our own defense, we give our opponents ammunition. We show our fears, our desperation, our weak points. But silence, true, strategic silence, creates a vacuum that others feel compelled to fill with their own words, their own admissions, their own increasingly frantic attempts to provoke a response. The transformation begins with understanding that most human communication is not about conveying information but about managing anxiety. When someone attacks you verbally, they expect a response not because they need information from you, but because your response helps manage their own psychological state. Your anger validates their aggression. Your fear confirms their power. Your pleading satisfies their need for dominance. But your silence? Your silence leaves them with nothing but the echo of their own voice and the growing realization that they may have underestimated their target. Marcus watched as his mentor's confident presentation began to falter. Without the expected pushback, the accusations began to sound increasingly hollow, even to their author. The PowerPoint slides that had seemed so damning now appeared one-sided, incomplete. Board members began to ask questions, not of Marcus, who continued to maintain his strategic silence, but of his accuser. Why wasn't more evidence presented? Why had this investigation been conducted in secret? Why were they only hearing one side of the story? The second principle reveals itself here: silence transforms you from defendant to judge. When you refuse to play the role of the accused, others must confront the uncomfortable possibility that perhaps they are the ones being evaluated. Your silent observation becomes a mirror reflecting their own methods, their own motivations, their own character. They begin to feel exposed under your wordless scrutiny, and this exposure breeds mistakes. But the power of silence extends far beyond its defensive applications. In the intricate chess game of human relationships, whether in business, politics, or personal affairs, the ability to remain strategically silent while others reveal their positions is perhaps the most valuable skill one can develop. It requires, however, a fundamental transformation of the self, the deliberate destruction of the parts of our personality that crave validation, that fear judgment, that need to be understood. This destruction is not metaphorical. It is a real, necessary dismantling of the psychological structures that make us vulnerable to manipulation. The part of you that needs to be liked must die. The part of you that requires others to understand your motivations must be eliminated. The part of you that seeks approval or fears disapproval must be surgically removed from your psychological makeup. What remains after this destruction is something harder, more resilient, more powerful, a self that cannot be broken because it has already been broken and rebuilt according to your own specifications. The process is neither quick nor comfortable. It requires you to sit with discomfort, to allow others to misunderstand you, to be seen as cold or calculating or mysterious. It requires you to watch opportunities for immediate gratification pass by in service of longer-term strategic advantage. Most people cannot endure this process because they cannot bear to be misunderstood or disliked, even temporarily. Marcus had begun his transformation months earlier, when he first discovered his mentor's betrayal. The old Marcus would have confronted him immediately, seeking explanation, perhaps hoping for remorse or justification. The old Marcus would have tried to work within the system, believing that truth and justice would ultimately prevail. But the old Marcus was weak, naive, vulnerable. So Marcus killed him. Not literally, of course, but psychologically. He systematically identified every aspect of his personality that made him vulnerable, his trust, his need for approval, his belief in fairness, and methodically eliminated them. He studied his mentor's methods, learning to think like his enemy. He cultivated relationships not based on genuine affection but on strategic value. He learned to observe without judging, to listen without reacting, to plan without revealing his intentions. The third principle of strategic silence is perhaps the most crucial: it must be purposeful, not passive. Random silence is merely antisocial behavior. Strategic silence is a weapon wielded with precision and intent. It requires careful observation of your target's psychological patterns. When do they become uncomfortable? What triggers their need to fill conversational gaps? How do they respond to uncertainty? What are their tells when they feel they're losing control of a situation? Every person has a different relationship with silence. Some become aggressive, escalating their attacks in an attempt to provoke response. Others become conciliatory, suddenly, eager to explain themselves or make peace. Still others become suspicious, wondering what you're planning or what you know that they don't. Understanding these patterns allows you to use silence as a scalpel rather than a club, cutting precisely where your target is most vulnerable. In the boardroom, Marcus watched his mentor cycling through all three responses. First came aggression, louder accusations, more dramatic gestures, appeals to the board members' sense of justice and duty. When this failed to provoke the expected response, he shifted to conciliation, suddenly, acknowledging Marcus's years of loyal service, suggesting that perhaps this was all a misunderstanding that could be resolved quietly. Finally, suspicion crept into his voice as he began to wonder what Marcus might know, what evidence he might possess, what strategy he might be employing. Each phase revealed more weakness, more desperation, more valuable intelligence. The board members began to see what Marcus had seen months ago: a man whose composure cracked under pressure, whose leadership style relied on intimidation and manipulation rather than genuine authority. They began to question not just the specific accusations but the broader judgment of someone who could be so obviously rattled by a subordinate's silence. The fourth principle emerges from this dynamic: silence forces authenticity. When people cannot gauge your response, they cannot calibrate their presentation accordingly. They must either remain true to their actual position or risk being exposed as actors playing to an unresponsive audience. Most people, under sufficient pressure, will eventually reveal their true nature rather than maintain a performance that seems to be failing. This authenticity is valuable intelligence, but it's also something more profound. It's an opportunity to see past the masks and manipulations that define so much of human interaction. When you master strategic silence, you begin to see the world as it actually is rather than as people pretend it to be. You see the fear behind aggression, the insecurity behind arrogance, the calculation behind apparent spontaneity. But, perhaps the most significant transformation occurs within yourself. As you learn to be comfortable with others' discomfort, as you develop the strength to be misunderstood without feeling compelled to explain yourself, as you build the discipline to observe rather than react, you become fundamentally less controllable. The levers that others typically use to influence behavior, shame, anger, fear, the desire to be liked, gradually lose their power over you. This is not to say that you become emotionless or inhuman. Rather, you develop the ability to experience emotions without being controlled by them, to understand others' attempts at manipulation without being vulnerable to them. You retain the capacity for genuine connection while eliminating your susceptibility to exploitation. Marcus felt this transformation crystallizing as he sat in that boardroom. The old Marcus would have been consumed with anxiety, desperate to defend himself, terrified of the consequences. This Marcus was certainly aware of the stakes. His career, his reputation, perhaps his freedom were all on the line, but he was not controlled by this awareness. Instead, he was calculating, planning, waiting for the optimal moment to reveal what he had spent months preparing. The silence stretched beyond the point of normal social comfort, beyond the point where most people would feel compelled to speak. Board members began exchanging glances. The presentation had ground to a halt. His mentor's confident narrative had devolved into repetitive accusations that sounded increasingly hollow in the absence of any response. Finally, the CEO intervened. "Marcus," he said, his voice carrying both authority and curiosity, "you've heard some serious accusations. Don't you have anything to say in response? And here arrived the fifth principle: when you do break your strategic silence, it must be devastating. All the power you've accumulated through restraint, all the uncertainty you've created, all the mistakes your opponents have made while trying to provoke you, everything must be deployed with surgical precision in a single, overwhelming response." Marcus slowly opened the leather portfolio that had sat untouched before him throughout the presentation. He withdrew a single document and placed it in the center of the table where everyone could see it. It was a bank statement, his mentor's secret account in the Cayman Islands, showing deposits that perfectly matched the supposedly missing funds, along with additional amounts that suggested the embezzlement had been going on for years longer than anyone suspected. "I have just one question," Marcus said quietly, his first words since entering the room. "When exactly did you plan to stop?" The silence that followed was different from the one Marcus had maintained. This was the silence of shock, of exposure, of a carefully constructed narrative crumbling in real time. His mentor's face went through a series of rapid changes: confusion, recognition, calculation, and, finally, resignation. But Marcus wasn't finished. From his portfolio, he produced a second document, a complete audit trail showing how the embezzlement scheme worked, which other employees had been involved, knowingly or unknowingly, and how Marcus himself had been positioned as the fall guy through a series of forged documents and manipulated records. Then came the third document, a resignation letter, already signed and dated, along with a comprehensive transition plan that would minimize disruption to ongoing projects and ensure continuity of service to clients. "I'll be starting my own firm next month," Marcus said, his voice still quiet but carrying absolute confidence. "These transitions materials should help you manage the interim period until you find my replacement." The transformation was complete. In the space of 15 minutes, Marcus had gone from accused criminal to resignation tendering executive holding all the cards. The board members who had entered the room believing they were witnessing the exposure of a criminal now realized they were watching the departure of perhaps their most capable employee, someone who had not only discovered and documented their CEO's criminal activity but had planned his exit strategy with the same methodical precision. Part 2, the crucible of self-destruction. The creation of an indestructible self begins with the systematic destruction of the vulnerable self, but this process is far more complex and dangerous than most realize. It is not simply a matter of toughening up or developing a thicker skin. It requires the deliberate dismantling of the psychological structures that have defined your identity since childhood, followed by the careful reconstruction of something entirely new, something that serves your interests rather than your fears. Maya understood this as she sat in the law library at 3 a.m, surrounded by case files and legal precedents, preparing for what she knew would be the most important trial of her career. Not because of the stakes, though they were considerable, but because it would be the first time she would appear in court as the person she had chosen to become rather than the person she had been trained to be. 6 months earlier, she had been a different attorney entirely. Brilliant, certainly, but hampered by a fatal weakness: she needed to be right more than she needed to win. She needed to be ethical more than she needed to be effective. She needed to be liked more than she needed to be respected. These needs had cost her case after case, as opposing counsel exploited her predictable moral boundaries and her compulsive honesty. The turning point had come during the Morrison case, a medical malpractice suit where she represented a family whose child had been paralyzed due to clear physician negligence. The case should have been straightforward, the evidence overwhelming. But, opposing counsel, a veteran litigator named Richardson, had systematically destroyed her presentation not through superior legal argument but through psychological manipulation. He had praised her ethics while subtly questioning her competence. He had acknowledged her passion while suggesting it clouded her judgment. He had complimented her thoroughness while implying she was naive about how the real world worked. Each compliment was a trap, each acknowledgement a weapon turned against her. But the killing blow had come when he had privately suggested that perhaps they could work out a settlement that would be fair to everyone involved, a fraction of what her clients deserved, but enough to avoid the uncertainty of trial. He had presented this as a kindness to her, a way to save face while learning from the experience. And the old Maya, the Maya who trusted in good faith and fair dealing, had almost accepted. That night, she had gone home and looked at herself honestly for the first time in years. She saw someone whose greatest strengths had been turned into weaknesses, whose virtues had become vulnerabilities, whose desire to do good had made her ineffective at actually achieving good outcomes. She saw someone who would always lose because she was playing a different game than her opponents. So she decided to kill that version of herself. The process began with a systematic catalog of every psychological weakness that made her vulnerable to manipulation. Her need for approval meant she could be controlled through praise or criticism. Her commitment to fairness made her predictable and exploitable. Her empathy could be weaponized against her own clients' interests. Her honesty prevented her from using the misdirection and strategic ambiguity that more successful attorneys employed routinely. One by one, she began dismantling these characteristics. Not through suppression, that would only make them stronger, but through replacement. Where there had been a need for approval, she cultivated indifference to others' opinions. Where there had been compulsive honesty, she developed strategic communication. Where there had been empathy that could be exploited, she built emotional firewalls that protected her judgment while still allowing her to connect with clients effectively. The transformation was neither quick nor comfortable. For months, she felt like she was wearing someone else's skin, acting from a script written by a stranger. Colleagues noticed the change, some appreciatively, others with concern. Her success rate began to improve dramatically, but the methods she employed to achieve these successes would have horrified the attorney she had been a year earlier. In the Morrison case retrial, she had found grounds to challenge the original verdict. She employed techniques that the old Maya would have considered unethical, even though they were perfectly legal. She researched the opposing counsel's psychological profile, identifying his patterns and weaknesses. She discovered his tendency to become overconfident when he felt he was winning, his habit of making subtle personal attacks when he felt threatened, his need to be seen as the smartest person in the room. Then, she systematically exploited these weaknesses. She allowed him to believe he was dominating the early stages of the trial, letting him grow overconfident and careless. She baited him into making personal attacks that alienated the jury. She set traps that forced him to choose between looking foolish and revealing the weakness of his case. But the most crucial element of her strategy involved silence, strategic, purposeful silence at moments when her opponent expected reaction. When he made what he clearly thought was a devastating point, instead of responding immediately, she would simply make a note and continue with her plan line of questioning. When he objected to her evidence, she would withdraw the question without argument, leaving the jury to wonder what information was being hidden from them. This silence served multiple purposes. It denied him the validation he sought from her reactions. It created uncertainty about her strategy and the strength of her position. Most importantly, it forced him to escalate his tactics in increasingly desperate attempts to provoke the response he needed to gauge his effectiveness. The principle Maya had discovered was this: most people's sense of security depends on their ability to predict and control others' responses. When you become unpredictable, not through randomness, but through strategic unpredictability, you destabilize their psychological equilibrium and force them to make mistakes. But the deeper principle was about the relationship between vulnerability and power. Every emotional need you have is a lever that others can use to control you. Every predictable reaction you exhibit is intelligence you're providing to your opponents. Every psychological boundary you maintain is a limitation on your strategic options. The process of destroying the weak self is essentially the process of identifying and eliminating these control points. It requires you to become comfortable with being misunderstood, disliked, even feared. It requires you to prioritize effectiveness over perception, results over process, strategic advantage over immediate gratification. This transformation is not without cost. The person Maya became was undeniably more effective, but also more isolated. The authentic connections she had valued were replaced by strategic relationships. The moral certainty that had once guided her decisions was replaced by situational ethics that prioritized outcomes over methods. But, the alternative, remaining vulnerable to manipulation by those with fewer scruples, was ultimately a greater moral failure. The old Maya's ethical purity had been a luxury she could afford only because others were paying the price for her ineffectiveness. Her clients deserved an advocate who could win, not one who could lose with dignity. The courtroom became her laboratory for testing the principles of strategic human interaction. She learned to read micro-expressions, to identify the emotional patterns that governed decision-making, to understand the subconscious biases that influenced supposedly rational judgments. She developed the ability to influence without obviously persuading, to lead without appearing to lead, to control conversations while seeming to merely participate in them. Each skill she developed made her more formidable, but also more alone. The people who had appreciated her old methods, her honesty, her directness, her moral clarity, found her new approach unsettling. She was still fighting for justice, still representing deserving clients, still achieving better outcomes than before, but the method she used created distance between herself and those who preferred to believe that good intentions were sufficient for good results. This isolation was perhaps the most crucial part of the transformation. To become truly indestructible, you must become comfortable with solitude, not just physical solitude, but psychological solitude. You must be able to function without external validation, without the comfort of shared beliefs, without the security of belonging to a group that shares your methods and values. The weak self requires community, consensus, approval. It needs others to confirm its reality, validate its choices, support its identity. The strong self that emerges from the destruction of weakness is fundamentally self-sufficient. It may choose to form alliances, but it doesn't require them. It may value others' opinions, but it isn't controlled by them. It may seek companionship, but it doesn't depend on it for psychological stability. This self-sufficiency is what makes destruction by others impossible. When you no longer need anything from other people, approval, understanding, acceptance, love, they have no leverage over you. They cannot threaten to withdraw what you don't require. They cannot manipulate emotions you have learned to manage independently. They cannot exploit vulnerabilities you have systematically eliminated. Maya tested this principle during the final phase of the Morrison trial. Richardson, increasingly desperate as his case deteriorated, attempted to use personal attacks to destabilize her. He questioned her ethics in open court, suggested she had manufactured evidence, implied she was exploiting her client's tragedy for personal gain. The old Maya would have been devastated by these attacks, would have felt compelled to defend herself, would have lost focus on her strategic objectives in favor of emotional self-protection. The new Maya simply acknowledged his statements with a slight nod and continued with her methodical destruction of his case. She had prepared for this moment, knowing that personal attacks were his inevitable response to professional pressure. She had evidence ready, not just legal evidence, but psychological evidence of his pattern of behavior when losing cases. She had documented his history of making personal attacks on opposing counsel, particularly female attorneys. She had researched similar cases where he had employed identical tactics. When the moment was right, when he had made himself maximally vulnerable through his obvious desperation, she deployed this preparation with surgical precision. Not through direct confrontation, which would have appeared petty, but through strategic questions that forced him to either admit to his pattern of behavior or appear dishonest to the jury. "Mr. Richardson," she said calmly, "is it your standard practice to question opposing counsel's ethics when you're losing a case, or am I a special exception?" The question was devastating precisely because it was unanswerable. Any response he gave would confirm the premise that he was losing, while also acknowledging either that he routinely made unprofessional personal attacks or that she had somehow merited special negative treatment. The silence that followed was the silence of checkmate. He could not respond without damaging his position further. The jury could see his discomfort, his anger, his inability to formulate an effective response. His credibility, already damaged by the evidence Maya had presented, crumbled entirely. But the victory was not just tactical. It represented the complete transformation of Maya from someone who could be defeated by psychological manipulation into someone who could turn such manipulation back on its source. She had become not just immune to a particular type of attack, but capable of using her opponent's aggression as a weapon against them. This is the ultimate goal of self-destruction and reconstruction, to become not just invulnerable, but to transform attempted attacks into strategic advantages. When someone tries to shame you and you feel no shame, their attempt to manipulate becomes intelligence about their character and methods. When someone tries to anger you and you remain calm, their loss of control becomes your gain of advantage. When someone tries to intimidate you and you remain unaffected, their aggression becomes evidence of their weakness. The process requires patience, discipline, and a willingness to endure short-term discomfort for long-term strategic advantage. It requires you to give up the immediate gratification of emotional expression in favor of the sustained satisfaction of tactical superiority. Most importantly, it requires you to redefine your identity around your capabilities rather than your vulnerabilities, your achievements rather than your injuries, your strategic position rather than your emotional state. Maya walked out of that courtroom not just with a victory for her clients, but with the knowledge that she had successfully completed her own transformation. She was no longer the person who could be manipulated through ethical appeals or destabilized through personal attacks. She had become something harder, more resilient, more effective, and, ultimately, more capable of achieving the justice she had always sought. Part 3, The Fortress of Invulnerability. The final stage of psychological transformation is not merely the absence of weakness, but the presence of an inner fortress so complete, so well defended, that external attacks do not simply fail, they strengthen the structure they attempt to breach. This fortress is built not from the denial of human nature, but from the complete understanding and mastery of it, both in oneself and others. Thomas had achieved this state, though he would not have recognized it in the description. To him, he was simply a man who had learned to see clearly, to observe human behavior without the distortions of sentiment, to understand motivations without being influenced by them, to predict responses without being constrained by conventional morality. He had become, in the truest sense, a student of power in its purest form. His office on the 43rd floor of the Meridian building overlooked a city full of people pursuing power through conventional means, accumulating wealth, building networks, cultivating reputations, seeking recognition. From his perspective, they were children playing with toys, unaware that real power operated according to entirely different principles. The meeting scheduled for this afternoon would demonstrate those principles in practice. 3 men were coming to destroy him, or so they believed. They had spent months building their coalition, gathering evidence of his supposed misconduct, preparing legal challenges to his authority within the organization. They had convinced themselves that they possessed overwhelming force, that their combined influence would be sufficient to remove him from his position and divide his considerable assets among themselves. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, given their fundamental misapprehension of how power actually functioned, was that they had been participating in an elaborate theater piece that Thomas had been directing from the beginning. Every move they had made, every alliance they had formed, every piece of evidence they had gathered, had been anticipated and incorporated into a larger design. The first man, Davidson, believed he was motivated by justice. He had discovered what appeared to be irregularities in Thomas's handling of corporate funds and had convinced himself that exposing this corruption was his moral duty. What Davidson didn't realize was that these irregularities had been deliberately created as bait, designed to draw him into exactly this confrontation at exactly this time. The second man, Chen, was motivated by ambition. He saw Thomas's downfall as an opportunity for his own advancement and had been carefully building relationships with board members who might support his bid for leadership. Chen was unaware that Thomas had been quietly feeding him information about these board members' preferences and concerns, subtly shaping his approach to make him maximally useful as an unwitting agent. The third man, Rodriguez, was driven by revenge. 3 years earlier, Thomas had blocked his promotion to a position Rodriguez believed he deserved. Rodriguez had been nurturing his resentment ever since, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. He didn't know that his promotion had been blocked not out of malice, but because Thomas had needed him to remain in his current position for precisely this moment. Each man thought he was pursuing his own agenda. None realized that their individual motivations had been identified, analyzed, and weaponized against them. They were not conspirators, they were instruments, each playing exactly the note Thomas required for his larger composition. The principle underlying this orchestration was deceptively simple: people are most controllable when they believe they are in control. Davidson felt powerful because he believed he was pursuing justice. Chen felt confident because he believed he was seizing opportunity. Rodriguez felt satisfied because he believed he was achieving revenge. These feelings of agency and purpose made them infinitely more useful than they would have been as conscious puppets. But the deeper principle was about the nature of invulnerability itself. True invulnerability doesn't come from building walls, walls can be breached. It comes from understanding your enemies so completely that their attacks become part of your strategy. When you can predict not just what someone will do, but why they will do it and how they will feel about doing it, you can position yourself to benefit from their actions regardless of their intentions. This level of understanding requires more than observation, it requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to other human beings. You must learn to see them not as peers engaged in mutual interaction, but as systems to be understood, predicted, and influenced. This doesn't require you to be cruel or exploitative. Indeed, the most sophisticated applications of these principles often benefit all parties involved. But it does require you to abandon the comforting fiction that human relationships are based on equality, mutual understanding, and shared values. Thomas had learned this lesson gradually, through a series of increasingly complex situations that had taught him the gap between how people claimed to operate and how they actually functioned. He had discovered that most people's stated principles were merely social performance, easily abandoned when sufficient pressure was applied to their real motivations. He had learned that logical arguments were far less persuasive than emotional triggers, that conscious reasoning was usually just post hoc justification for unconscious impulses, that people's greatest strengths were inevitably connected to exploitable weaknesses. Most importantly, he had learned that the majority of human conflict was caused not by genuine incompatibility of interests, but by misunderstanding of motivations and poor strategic thinking. When you understood what people actually wanted, not what they said they wanted, but what their actions revealed they prioritized, you could usually find ways to give it to them while achieving your own objectives. The three men arriving this afternoon thought they wanted justice, advancement, and revenge respectively. But their actions revealed different priorities. Davidson wanted to feel important, to be recognized as someone who could make a difference. Chen wanted security and status more than he wanted any specific position. Rodriguez wanted acknowledgement of his worth more than he wanted actual harm to come to Thomas. Understanding these deeper motivations had allowed Thomas to design a resolution that would satisfy all parties while strengthening his own position. The supposed irregularities in corporate funding were indeed real, but they were part of a larger restructuring project that would ultimately save the company millions of dollars while eliminating several redundant positions. Davidson would be credited with discovering this efficiency opportunity and would be given a significant role in implementing the changes. Chen's bid for leadership was actually quite stronger than he realized. Thomas had been quietly preparing to recommend him for a different position, one that would give him more authority and visibility than the role he thought he was pursuing. The board members Chen had been courting would support this recommendation enthusiastically, particularly since it would appear to be Chen's own initiative rather than Thomas's manipulation. Rodriguez's blocked promotion had been a temporary tactical necessity, but the skills he had developed in his current role during the intervening years had made him far more qualified for advancement than he had been originally. The position that was about to become available, created by the restructuring that Davidson would help implement, was perfect for Rodriguez's enhanced capabilities. Each man would leave the meeting believing he had achieved his objectives through his own skill and determination. The company would benefit from improved efficiency and better allocation of human resources. Thomas would maintain his position while gaining three valuable allies who would be personally invested in the success of initiatives that served his broader strategic goals. This outcome was possible only because Thomas had moved beyond the conventional understanding of conflict as zero-sum competition. Instead of trying to defeat his opponents, he had worked to understand their actual needs and find ways to fulfill those needs while advancing his own interests. Instead of defending against their attacks, he had incorporated their energy into his own designs. But, perhaps the most crucial element of his approach was the strategic use of silence throughout the process. While his opponents had been busy talking, building their case, gathering supporters, planning their presentation, Thomas had been listening. He had allowed them to reveal their strategies, their concerns, their psychological patterns, their deepest motivations. He had remained silent not out of passivity, but out of recognition that premature response would only reduce his strategic options. When you speak, you reveal information about your thinking, your emotional state, your priorities, your plans. When you remain silent, you force others to fill that void with increasingly revealing communications. Over months of careful attention, Thomas had compiled a comprehensive psychological profile of each opponent, not through investigation or surveillance, but simply through patient observation of what they chose to say and when they chose to say it. This intelligence gathering had been invisible to his targets precisely because it involved no active probing, no obvious research, no direct questions. It was simply the systematic observation of information that people freely provided when they felt they were not being studied. The most revealing data came not from formal communications, but from casual comments, emotional reactions, unconscious patterns of behavior that people displayed when they thought no one was paying attention. The meeting began exactly as Thomas had predicted. Davidson presented his evidence with the righteous intensity of someone who believed he was exposing corruption. Chen laid out his vision for new leadership with the confidence of someone who believed he was seizing an unprecedented opportunity. Rodriguez detailed Thomas's supposed failures with the satisfaction of someone who believed he was finally achieving long-delayed justice. Thomas listened in silence, occasionally making notes, never interrupting, never defending, never explaining. His silence was not the passive silence of someone who had no response, but the active silence of someone who was allowing others to complete their own destruction. Each accusation they made, each piece of evidence they presented, each argument they advanced was exactly what Thomas needed to implement the solution he had prepared. When they finished their presentations, the room fell into uncomfortable silence. They had expected anger, denial, defensiveness, negotiation. Instead, Thomas simply closed his notebook and looked at each of them calmly. "Gentlemen," he said finally, "you've identified exactly the issues I've been hoping someone would notice. Davidson, your analysis of the funding irregularities is remarkably thorough. I'd like you to lead the restructuring project. We'll need to address them. Chen, your leadership vision aligns perfectly with the direction we need to take. I'm recommending you for the regional director position that's opening next quarter. Rodriguez, the efficiency gains from this restructuring will create exactly the kind of senior role where your skills would be most valuable." The silence that followed was different from the strategic silence Thomas had maintained. This was the silence of cognitive dissonance, of people struggling to reconcile their expectations with reality, of minds trying to process an outcome they had not considered possible. "I don't understand," Davidson said slowly. "You're not denying the irregularities?" "Of course not," Thomas replied. "They're part of a larger project I've been developing. Your investigation has given us the perfect justification to move forward with it immediately, rather than waiting for the usual bureaucratic approvals." Chen looked confused. "But we came here to challenge your leadership. And you've demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and initiative that the company needs in its leadership," Thomas said. "Why would I resist that?" Rodriguez was the first to understand what had happened. The slow realization crossing his face was almost painful to watch. "You knew," he said quietly. "You knew we were coming. You knew what we were going to say. You planned this." "I planned to find the best way to address some organizational challenges while ensuring that talented people like yourselves had opportunities to make meaningful contributions," Thomas said. "The specific form that solution took depended on what you chose to bring to my attention. This was the final principle of invulnerability. When you understand the system completely enough, apparent attacks become merely additional information to be incorporated into your planning. When you can predict not just what people will do, but why they will do it and how they will respond to various outcomes, you can design solutions that transform opposition into cooperation, conflict into collaboration, threats into opportunities." The three men left the meeting not as defeated opponents, but as inadvertent allies whose own actions had positioned them perfectly to benefit from Thomas's broader strategic vision. They would implement changes that served his interests while believing they were pursuing their own agendas. They would become advocates for his leadership while thinking they had successfully challenged it. But the deeper victory was not tactical, it was philosophical. Thomas had demonstrated that the conventional understanding of power, based on force and domination, was ultimately self-defeating. True power came from understanding, from patience, from the ability to work with human nature rather than against it. It came from silence rather than rhetoric, from listening rather than speaking, from planning rather than reacting. The fortress of invulnerability was not built from walls, but from understanding. When you comprehend the patterns that govern human behavior, when you can predict the responses that various stimuli will generate, when you understand the deeper motivations that drive people's surface actions, you become essentially immune to conventional forms of attack. Not because attacks cannot be launched against you, but because you can incorporate those attacks into your own strategic framework. This immunity extends beyond professional or political conflicts into every aspect of human interaction. When you are no longer vulnerable to shame, anger, fear, or desire for approval, when you no longer need anything from others that you cannot provide for yourself, when you have destroyed every weakness that could be exploited against you, you achieve a form of psychological freedom that most people cannot imagine. This freedom is not the absence of connection to others, but the presence of choice about how and when to connect. It is not the absence of emotion, but the mastery of emotion. It is not the absence of desire, but the independence from having those desires fulfilled by others. It is, ultimately, the transformation from someone who can be acted upon to someone who acts, from someone who responds to circumstances to someone who creates them, from someone who can be destroyed by others to someone who has already destroyed every part of themselves that was vulnerable to destruction. In the end, the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because there is nothing left for them to destroy, only the fortress of strength, understanding, and strategic wisdom that he has built from the ruins of his former vulnerabilities.